The black limousine pulled up to the golden gates of Buckingham Palace on a cold Tuesday evening in November. Inside sat Viktor "Thunder" Petrov, the current UFC heavyweight champion of the world. His massive frame barely fit in the luxury car's back seat, and his hands, scarred from countless fights, drummed nervously on his knees. Viktor had grown up in the rough streets of Detroit, where respect was earned with fists and attitude was everything. Now at 32 years old, he was worth millions and commanded fear in the octagon. But tonight felt different. Tonight he was stepping into a world he didn't understand. His manager, Tony, sat across from him, straightening his own tie for the 10th time. "Remember what we talked about, champ? This charity event is huge for your image. The palace invited you personally. Just smile, shake hands, and try not to get into any trouble." Viktor grunted in response. He hated these fancy events. All the fake smiles and polite conversation made his skin crawl. He'd rather face 10 opponents in the ring than deal with 1 hour of small talk with rich people who looked down on him. The car door opened, and a rush of cold London air hit his face. Camera flashes immediately started going off as photographers captured his arrival. Viktor stepped out, his designer suit barely containing his muscled physique. He had insisted on wearing his championship belt over his tuxedo jacket, despite Tony's protests. The palace loomed before him, its windows glowing warmly in the evening light. Guards in their famous red uniforms stood perfectly still at various points around the entrance. Viktor had seen them in movies and tourist photos, but seeing them in person was different. They looked like statues, completely motionless. "Welcome to Buckingham Palace, Mr. Petrov," said a well-dressed woman with a clipboard. "I'm Catherine, and I'll be your escort this evening. Please follow me." As they walked through the main entrance, Viktor's eyes widened despite himself. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, decorated with gold and crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than most people's houses. Paintings of long-dead kings and queens stared down at him from ornate frames. "The Queen won't be attending tonight," Catherine explained as they walked through corridors lined with red carpet, "but several members of the royal family will be present, along with other distinguished guests. The charity we're supporting tonight helps military veterans transition back to civilian life." Viktor nodded, though he wasn't really listening. He was too busy taking in the overwhelming luxury around him. Everything seemed designed to make visitors feel small and out of place. The opposite of the octagon where he was king, they passed several more guards during their walk. Each one stood perfectly still, eyes forward, not acknowledging the group as they passed. Viktor found their discipline impressive but also irritating. In his world, when someone walked by, you at least nodded. This felt disrespectful. The main ballroom took his breath away. The room was massive, with mirrors covering the walls and another enormous chandelier hanging from the center of the ceiling. About 200 people were already mingling, all dressed in expensive suits and elegant gowns. Servers moved between them carrying champagne and fancy appetizers on silver trays. "There are some important people here tonight who'd love to meet you," Catherine said. "The Duke of Cambridge is particularly interested in your work with youth boxing programs." Viktor barely heard her. He was scanning the room, automatically assessing threats and exits like he'd been trained to do since childhood. Old habits died hard even in a palace. A photographer approached them. "Mr. Petrov, could we get a few shots by the main entrance?" Before Catherine could object, Viktor was already walking back toward the doorway. He loved photo opportunities, especially ones that showed off his success. The photographer positioned him near a large painting of some old king. "Actually, sir," said a quiet but firm voice behind him, "photography isn't permitted in this area." Viktor turned around to see one of the red-uniformed guards standing nearby. The man was probably in his 30s, with sharp blue eyes and a perfectly groomed mustache. His name tag read Sergeant Thompson. Unlike the other guards Viktor had seen, this one had spoken. "What's the problem?" Viktor asked, his voice carrying an edge. "It's just a picture." "I understand, sir, but this particular area contains sensitive historical artifacts. Photography is restricted to the designated areas only." The guard's tone was polite but unwavering. Viktor felt his jaw tighten. He wasn't used to being told what he couldn't do, especially by someone he could probably knock out with one punch. "Listen, buddy," Viktor said, stepping closer to the guard. "Do you know who I am?" Sergeant Thompson didn't flinch or step back. "Yes, sir. You're the UFC heavyweight champion. However, the photography restrictions apply to all guests equally." Tony appeared at Victor's elbow, sensing trouble. "No problem at all," he said quickly to the guard. "We'll move to the approved area. Sorry about that." But Victor wasn't ready to back down. The guard's calm, almost dismissive tone reminded him of teachers and social workers from his childhood who had looked at him like he was nothing but trouble, people who thought they were better than him. "You got something against fighters?" Victor asked, his voice getting louder. A few nearby guests turned to look. "Not at all, sir," Sergeant Thompson replied, his expression never changing. "I'm simply doing my job." Catherine reappeared, looking flustered. "Mr. Petrov, perhaps we should move to the main reception area. There are several sponsors waiting to meet you." Victor stared at the guard for another long moment. Something about the man's complete composure irritated him more than any trash talk he'd ever heard in the octagon. At least his opponents showed emotion. This guy was like a robot. "Yeah, whatever," Victor finally muttered, allowing Tony to guide him away. As they walked toward the main crowd, Victor kept glancing back at Sergeant Thompson, who had returned to his position and stood motionless once again. The champion's hands were already clenched into fists, though he didn't realize it yet. The evening was just beginning, and already Victor felt like the palace walls were closing in around him. He grabbed a champagne glass from a passing server and downed it in one gulp, ignoring Tony's disapproving look. "Just remember why we're here," Tony whispered. "Your reputation needs this," but Victor was no longer thinking about his reputation. He was thinking about respect, and how a palace guard had just made him look small in front of cameras and wealthy strangers. In his world, that kind of disrespect had consequences. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock the world, though nobody in that elegant ballroom could have predicted what was about to unfold. Sergeant David Thompson had been guarding the royal family for 8 years, and in all that time, he had never broken protocol. Not once. His military background had prepared him for this role perfectly. Before joining the Queen's Guard, he had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where staying calm under pressure meant the difference between life and death. Tonight was supposed to be routine, a charity event with celebrities and wealthy donors. Thompson had worked dozens of similar events. His job was simple: stand at his assigned position, watch for security threats, and enforce palace rules. No matter what happened, he was to remain professional and composed. The palace had strict rules that everyone had to follow. No exceptions. No photography in certain areas. No touching the artifacts. No loud voices or disruptive behavior. These weren't just suggestions. They were ironclad rules that protected centuries of British history and tradition. Thompson had studied the guest list earlier. Politicians, business leaders, movie stars, and athletes would all be attending. He knew that some of them might try to bend the rules, thinking their fame made them special. But Thompson had dealt with difficult people before. The key was to remain calm and polite while being absolutely firm. When Victor Petrov arrived, Thompson noticed him immediately. The UFC champion was hard to miss. He was huge, probably 6'4", and at least 250 pounds of solid muscle. More importantly, Thompson recognized the look in his eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in soldiers who were ready for a fight, always scanning for trouble. Thompson had watched some of Victor's fights on television. The man was incredibly skilled, but also known for his explosive temper outside the ring. There had been incidents at nightclubs, arguments with reporters, and a few run-ins with police. Nothing too serious, but enough to show a pattern. As Victor moved through the palace corridors, Thompson observed his body language. The champion walked like he owned every room he entered. His shoulders were squared, his jaw was set, and he made eye contact with everyone like he was challenging them. This was a man who had never learned to back down from anything. The first sign of trouble came when Victor tried to take photos in the restricted area. Thompson had seen this happen before with other celebrities. They assumed their fame gave them special privileges. His job was to politely but firmly redirect them to the approved areas. When Thompson approached Victor about the photography restriction, he could immediately sense the tension. The champion's entire posture changed. His hands moved slightly away from his sides and his weight shifted to the balls of his feet. These were fighting stances that Thompson recognized from his own combat training. "Listen, buddy, do you know who I am?" Victor had asked. Thompson did know exactly who Victor was, but that didn't matter. Palace protocol applied to everyone equally. The Queen herself followed these same rules. Thompson had once seen a famous movie director get escorted out for trying to film in a restricted area, despite donating millions to charity. What concerned Thompson most was Victor's reaction to being told no. Most people might be embarrassed or annoyed, but they would comply. Victor looked genuinely angry, like someone had personally insulted him. His face was flushing red, and his breathing had changed. Thompson had learned to read people during his military service. In Afghanistan, knowing who might snap under pressure could save lives. Victor showed all the signs of someone building toward an outburst. The clenched jaw, the aggressive posture, the way he kept glancing around like he was looking for backup or an escape route. After Victor moved away with his manager, Thompson remained at his post. But he kept one eye on the champion throughout the evening. Palace security worked as a team, and Thompson quietly alerted the other guards to watch for potential problems. The ballroom was filled with the usual mix of high society conversation and polite laughter. Crystal glasses clinked together as guests toasted the evening's charitable cause. A string quartet played classical music from one corner while servers moved smoothly between the crowds with appetizers and champagne. Thompson could see Victor across the room, surrounded by a small group of admirers. The champion was telling a story, probably about one of his famous fights, using his hands to demonstrate punches and kicks. The group laughed and applauded, clearly impressed by his presence. But Thompson noticed that Victor kept drinking. He'd already seen the champion down at least 4 glasses of champagne in the first hour, and the evening was far from over. Alcohol and aggressive personalities were never a good combination, especially in a formal setting like this. Palace events required a different kind of behavior than most places. Voices were kept low and respectful. Movements were graceful and controlled. Even laughter was more subdued than normal. These weren't arbitrary rules. They reflected centuries of tradition and respect for the institution of the monarchy. Victor clearly didn't understand or appreciate these subtleties. Thompson watched him growing more animated as the evening progressed. His voice was getting louder, his gestures more dramatic. Other guests were starting to notice, though they were too polite to say anything directly. Thompson's radio crackled quietly in his earpiece. "All units, be advised we have reports of increasing noise levels in Section 3, came the voice of his supervisor. Section 3 was exactly where Victor was holding court. "Copy that," Thompson responded quietly. "I have eyes on the situation." The charity auction was about to begin, which meant all the guests would be gathering in one area. This could either calm Victor down as he focused on the event, or it could make things worse if he felt like he was being controlled or restricted further. Thompson had dealt with difficult guests before, but something about Victor felt different. Most people who caused problems at palace events were just drunk or showing off. Victor seemed to carry a deeper anger, like he was looking for a reason to prove himself. As a soldier, Thompson had learned that the best way to handle potential conflicts was to stay calm and professional no matter what happened. Getting emotional or taking things personally only made situations worse. His job was to protect the palace, the guests, and the centuries of tradition that these walls represented. The irony wasn't lost on Thompson that he was worried about a professional fighter at a charity event, meant to honor military veterans like himself. Victor was there to support people who had served their country, yet he seemed more interested in asserting his own dominance than helping others. Thompson adjusted his position slightly to get a better view of the auction area. In a few minutes, all the guests would be moving in that direction. If Victor was going to cause more problems, that's when it would likely happen. Large crowds, alcohol, and wounded pride were a dangerous combination. Little did Thompson know that his calm, professional demeanor was exactly what was fueling Victor's growing resentment. To the champion, Thompson's composure looked like arrogance, and his politeness felt like condescension. Two men from completely different worlds were about to clash in a way that would shock everyone present. By 9 o'clock, Victor had consumed 6 glasses of champagne and was feeling the effects. The alcohol wasn't making him drunk exactly, but it was removing his usual filters. Every slight real or imagined felt magnified. Every polite smile from the other guests looked fake. Every rule and restriction felt like a personal attack on his freedom. The charity auction had just concluded successfully, raising over £2 million for veteran support programs. Victor had bid on a few items, winning a vintage motorcycle and a week at a luxury resort in Scotland. His competitive nature wouldn't let him lose any bidding war, even though he had no real interest in either item. As the formal program ended, guests began mingling again in smaller groups. The atmosphere was more relaxed now, with people sharing stories and making connections for future business deals. Victor found himself gravitating toward a group of younger guests who seemed more impressed by his celebrity status than the older aristocrats. "You should see my training facility back in Vegas," Victor was saying to a group of fascinated listeners. 40,000 square feet of pure combat sports paradise. I've got Olympic wrestlers, former Navy SEALs, world champion boxers all training under one roof. The group nodded appreciatively, hanging on his every word. This was the kind of respect Victor was used to receiving. These people understood power and success. They didn't look at him like he was some kind of curiosity or threat. But even as he enjoyed their attention, Victor's eyes kept drifting toward Sergeant Thompson, who remained at his post near the main entrance. The guard hadn't moved in over 2 hours, standing perfectly still with his hands clasped behind his back. It was unnatural, almost insulting how easily he ignored everything happening around him. "Excuse me for a moment," Victor told his admirers, and started walking toward the guard. Tony, his manager, immediately sensed trouble and followed. "Victor, what are you doing?" "The night's almost over. Don't mess this up now." "I'm just going to have a friendly conversation," Victor replied, but his tone suggested anything but friendliness. As Victor approached, Sergeant Thompson's trained instincts kicked in. He could sense someone moving toward him with purpose, and his peripheral vision caught the champion's determined stride. Thompson remained motionless, but his awareness heightened immediately. "Hey there, soldier boy," Victor said as he stopped directly in front of Thompson. "Must be pretty boring just standing there all night, huh?" Thompson's eyes flickered toward Victor for just a moment before returning to their forward position. "Good evening, sir," he said politely. "I hope you're enjoying the event." Victor stepped closer, now standing less than 3 feet from the guard.
"You know where I come from. When someone talks to you, you look at them."
"It's called respect." "I apologize if I've given any offense, sir," Thompson replied, still looking straight ahead. "I'm required to maintain my position and watch for security concerns." The response only irritated Victor more. Everything about this guy rubbed him the wrong way. The perfect posture, the clipped accent, the way he could stay so calm while being directly challenged. It reminded Victor of every authority figure who had ever looked down on him. Security concerns? Victor laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What kind of security threat do you think is going to happen at a fancy party like this? You afraid someone might steal a teacup?" Tony moved closer, trying to defuse the situation. "Victor, come on. Let's go check out the dessert table. I heard they have some amazing chocolate sculptures." But Victor ignored his manager completely. He was focused entirely on Thompson now, like a predator sizing up prey. "I'm talking to you, guard. Don't you think it's rude to ignore someone who's trying to be friendly?" Thompson finally turned his head slightly to make eye contact with Victor. "Sir, I appreciate your interest, but I need to maintain my duties. Perhaps we could continue this conversation after the event concludes." It was the wrong thing to say. Victor heard rejection and dismissal in the polite words. In his world, when someone didn't want to engage with you, it meant they thought they were better than you. And nobody was better than Viktor Petrov after the event. Victor's voice was getting louder now, causing other guests to glance in their direction. "You think you're too good to talk to me now? Do you have any idea what I've accomplished? What I've worked for?" Thompson's training told him to remain calm and professional, but he was beginning to recognize the signs of a serious problem developing. Victor's face was flushed, his hands were clenched, and his breathing was becoming more aggressive. This wasn't just a drunk guest being difficult. This was someone building toward violence. "Sir, I have tremendous respect for your accomplishments," Thompson said carefully. "I meant no disrespect whatsoever. I'm simply following palace protocol." "Palace protocol," Victor repeated mockingly. "Let me tell you something about protocol, buddy. In my world, we have protocol too. And when someone disrespects you in public, there are consequences." By now, their exchange had attracted the attention of several other guests and palace staff members. Catherine, Victor's escort, was hurrying over with a concerned expression. 2 other guards had subtly moved closer to Thompson's position, ready to assist if needed. Victor noticed the additional attention and felt his anger spike even higher. Now he was being treated like some kind of dangerous animal that needed to be controlled. The humiliation was complete. Every person in this fancy ballroom was looking at him like he was the problem, like he was the one who didn't belong. "You know what I think?" Victor said, his voice now loud enough that most of the nearby guests could hear clearly. "I think you British people are all the same. You act all polite and proper, but really you just think you're better than everyone else, especially people like me." Thompson could feel the situation spiraling out of control, but his training and experience kept him calm. He had dealt with hostile individuals before, both in the military and in his current role. The key was not to escalate the situation with any aggressive responses. "Mr. Petrov," Thompson said quietly, using Victor's name in an attempt to personalize their interaction, "I can assure you that I harbor no negative feelings toward you or anyone else. I'm simply doing my job as I was trained to do." But Victor was beyond reasoning now. The alcohol, the stress of being in an unfamiliar environment, and his own deep-seated insecurities about not being accepted by high society had created a perfect storm of rage. Everyone was watching him, judging him, waiting to see what the rough fighter would do in their civilized world. "Your job," Victor snarled. "Your job is to stand there like a statue and make people feel unwelcome in this museum you call a palace. Well, let me tell you something about jobs, soldier. My job is fighting, and I'm the best in the world at it." The threat in his words was unmistakable now. Several guests had started backing away, sensing that something serious was about to happen. Catherine was frantically speaking into her radio, calling for additional security support. Thompson remained perfectly still, but every muscle in his body was now coiled and ready. His military training had prepared him for situations exactly like this. He could see Victor's hands positioning themselves for a strike, could read the body language that preceded violence. In the span of just a few minutes, a simple misunderstanding about photography restrictions had escalated into a confrontation that was about to shock everyone in attendance. Two trained fighters from different worlds were seconds away from a clash that would be replayed on news stations around the globe. The elegant ballroom, filled with crystal chandeliers and priceless artwork, was about to witness an act of violence that would change both men's lives forever. What happened in the minutes following Victor's punch would become the most talked-about moment of the entire incident. As palace security escorted the stunned UFC champion toward the exit, all eyes remained fixed on Sergeant Thompson. Everyone expected him to break character now, to call for medical attention, or at least to show some human reaction to what had just occurred. Instead, Thompson did something that left even the most composed guests speechless. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a pristine white handkerchief and carefully dabbed the blood from the corner of his mouth. Then he folded the handkerchief neatly, returned it to his pocket and straightened his red uniform jacket with precise measured movements. The entire process took maybe 15 seconds. When he was finished, Thompson returned to his exact original position. Feet together, hands clasped behind his back, eyes focused straight ahead. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the assault, he would have looked like any other palace guard performing routine duties. But the swelling on his jaw told a different story. Within minutes, the left side of his face had begun to puff up noticeably. The punch had definitely broken something, probably in multiple places. Yet Thompson showed no sign of pain or distress. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect, his expression calm. Dr. Patricia Hayes, one of the event guests and a prominent London physician, couldn't stand watching any longer. She approached Thompson despite the obvious breach of protocol it represented. "Excuse me, Sergeant," she said quietly. "I'm a doctor. That injury needs immediate attention. You very likely have fractures that could lead to complications." Thompson's eyes moved slightly to acknowledge her presence, but he didn't turn his head. "Thank you for your concern, ma'am. I appreciate your professional opinion, but I'm required to complete my assigned shift." Dr. Hayes stared at him in amazement. "Young man, you've just taken a blow that would hospitalize most people. Your jaw could be broken in several places. You need x-rays and medical treatment immediately." "I understand, ma'am," Thompson replied politely. "Medical attention will be sought at the appropriate time." The doctor looked around helplessly at the other guests, as if seeking support for her position. But she was dealing with a level of military discipline that most civilians couldn't comprehend. Thompson's training had taught him that personal comfort and even personal safety came second to duty. Meanwhile, word of the incident was spreading beyond the ballroom. Palace staff members who hadn't witnessed the assault directly were hearing about it through radio communications and whispered conversations. The story grew more incredible with each telling. Did you hear what happened in the main ballroom? A UFC fighter punched one of our guards? Sergeant Thompson took a full-power hit and didn't even move? He's still at his post like nothing happened? The palace's head of security, Commander Richards, arrived within minutes of receiving the initial reports. He was a veteran of both military and police service, and he had seen plenty of unusual situations during his career. But this was unprecedented. Thompson, he said quietly as he approached the guard's position, I need a report on your condition. Sir, Thompson replied without moving from his position, I sustained a blow to the left side of my face from an aggressive guest. The individual has been removed from the premises. I am capable of completing my assigned duties. Commander Richards studied Thompson's swollen jaw and the slight bloodstain on his uniform. Son, you need medical attention. I'm ordering you to report to the infirmary immediately. For the first time since the assault, Thompson showed a flicker of emotion. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his eyes focused more intently straight ahead. Sir, with respect, my shift doesn't end for another 2 hours. Palace protocol requires my position to be maintained. It was an extraordinary moment. A subordinate was essentially refusing a direct order from his superior, but he was doing it in the name of duty rather than rebellion. Commander Richards found himself in the unusual position of having to order a man to stop being too professional. Sergeant Thompson, he said firmly, I am giving you a direct order to seek medical attention. Your position will be covered by another guard. Thompson finally allowed his shoulders to relax slightly. Yes, sir. Understood, sir. But even as he prepared to leave his post, Thompson's movements remained crisp and professional. He came to attention, saluted his commander, and began walking toward the exit with perfect military bearing. The swelling was now quite obvious, and he had to be in significant pain, but his stride never faltered. The guests watched his departure with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Many of them were wealthy, powerful people who were accustomed to being impressed by others, but they had never seen anything like the display of discipline and character they had just witnessed. Remarkable, murmured Lord Pemberton, a retired military officer who had served in the Falklands. Absolutely remarkable. That young man has shown more courage and discipline in 5 minutes than most people show in a lifetime. Lady Catherine Windsor, a member of the extended royal family, nodded in agreement. I've attended hundreds of these events and I've never seen anything like it. Most people would have been screaming for an ambulance. But it wasn't just Thompson's physical toughness that impressed the observers. It was his complete absence of anger or desire for revenge. He had been assaulted without provocation by someone much larger and stronger, and his only concern had been maintaining his duties and treating everyone, including his attacker, with professional respect. As news of the incident began to leak beyond the palace walls, the first phone calls started coming in to news organizations. Social media posts from guests at the event were already beginning to appear, though most were too shocked to provide coherent accounts of what they had witnessed. The early reports focused on the assault itself. UFC champion attacks palace guard. But as more details emerged, the story began to shift toward something much more remarkable. This wasn't just about a violent athlete losing control. This was about a soldier's response to unprovoked aggression that demonstrated a level of character most people couldn't imagine possessing. In the palace infirmary, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the on-duty physician, examined Thompson's injuries with growing amazement. X-rays confirmed multiple fractures in his jaw, along with significant soft tissue damage. It was exactly the kind of injury that would normally require immediate emergency surgery. Sergeant, she said as she reviewed the X-ray images, I have to ask you something, and please answer honestly. How much pain are you experiencing right now? Thompson considered the question carefully. It's manageable, ma'am. I've experienced worse during my military service. Dr. Morrison shook her head in wonder. Son, you have 3 separate fractures in your mandible and extensive bruising throughout your facial muscles. Most people would be unconscious from pain this severe. How on earth did you remain standing after taking that hit? Training, ma'am, Thompson replied simply. And duty. It was an answer that would be repeated in news reports around the world over the coming days. but in that moment it was just a simple statement of fact from a man who had never considered any other response possible. The unexpected reaction that shocked the ballroom was about to shock the entire world. Within 30 minutes of the assault, Victor found himself sitting in a stark interrogation room at Scotland Yard, the reality of his actions finally beginning to sink in. The adrenaline from the confrontation had worn off, replaced by a growing sense of dread as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. Detective Inspector Rebecca Walsh entered the room carrying a thick file and wearing the expression of someone who had dealt with many violent criminals, but never quite like this one. She had watched the preliminary footage from Palace security cameras, and she was still processing what she had seen. "Mr. Petrov," she began, settling into the chair across from him. "You've been arrested for assault on a member of the royal household staff. Before we begin, I need to inform you of your rights." Victor barely heard the formal warnings. He was thinking about Thompson's reaction, replaying those impossible moments when the guard had simply stood there and taken the punch like it was nothing. In all his years of fighting, he had never encountered anything like it. "I want to call my lawyer," Victor said quietly. "Of course, but first I need to ask you something unofficially. What were you thinking? You're a professional athlete with everything to lose. Why would you assault a palace guard at a charity event?" Victor looked up at her with confusion in his eyes. "I don't know. I really don't know. He wouldn't show me any respect. And then when I hit him, he didn't even react. How is that possible?" Detective Walsh had been wondering the same thing. She had spoken briefly with Sergeant Thompson before his transfer to the hospital, and his calm professionalism, even while discussing his own assault, was unlike anything she had encountered in 20 years of police work. Meanwhile, news of the incident was spreading at lightning speed. The first grainy cell phone videos had already been uploaded to social media platforms, and within an hour, news organizations around the world were leading with the story. The initial headlines focused on the shocking nature of the assault. UFC champion attacks Royal Guard. Violence at Buckingham Palace. Fighter goes berserk at charity event. But as more footage emerged and witness accounts began to surface, the narrative started to change dramatically. Television news anchors struggled to find words for what they were showing their audiences. The footage of Thompson absorbing the punch and remaining standing was being replayed in slow motion on every major network. Sports commentators who understood the power of Victor's striking ability were calling it the most incredible display of toughness they had ever witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," said veteran sports broadcaster Jim Mitchell on ESPN, "I've been covering combat sports for 30 years, and I can tell you that what we're seeing here defies explanation. Victor Petrov hits harder than almost any heavyweight in UFC history. That punch would have knocked out a rhinoceros. And this guard, this Sergeant Thompson, he just took it and kept standing. I've never seen anything like it. But the sports media coverage was just the beginning. The story was quickly picked up by mainstream news outlets who were fascinated by the human interest angle. Here was a story that combined celebrity scandal with an incredible display of character under pressure. At his luxury hotel in London, Victor's management team was in full crisis mode. Phone calls were pouring in from sponsors, reporters, and UFC officials. His manager, Tony, was frantically trying to control the damage, but it was already too late. Victor's main sponsor just dropped him, announced his publicist, staring at her laptop screen in horror. Sports drink company, athletic wear brand, and the video game deal. All gone. They're saying they can't be associated with someone who commits assault. The financial implications were staggering. Victor had endorsement deals worth over $15 million, most of which contained morality clauses that allowed companies to terminate their contracts for exactly this kind of behavior. In the space of a few hours, his net worth had dropped by more than half. But the UFC's response was even more devastating. Dana White, the organization's president, held an emergency press conference from Las Vegas just 4 hours after the incident. "I've seen the footage, and I'm absolutely disgusted," White told the assembled reporters. "Victor Petrov's actions tonight do not represent the values of the UFC or mixed martial arts in general. Effective immediately, he is suspended indefinitely pending a full investigation. We are also stripping him of his championship belt." The words hit Victor like a physical blow when his lawyer relayed them over the phone. Losing his title meant losing his identity. He wasn't just Victor Petrov anymore. He was the former champion who had thrown it all away in a moment of rage. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sergeant Thompson was undergoing emergency surgery to repair his fractured jaw. The medical team working on him was amazed that he had remained conscious and functional with such severe injuries. In 30 years of trauma surgery, Dr. James Crawford told his colleagues, "I've never seen someone maintain composure like that with these kinds of fractures." The pain must have been excruciating, but he showed no signs of distress whatsoever. The hospital staff had been briefed on what had happened, and word was spreading through the medical community about the remarkable patient in surgery room 3. Nurses and doctors were finding excuses to walk by and catch a glimpse of the man who had become an instant legend. Back at Scotland Yard, Detective Walsh was reviewing the evidence with her supervisor. The case was straightforward from a legal standpoint. They had multiple witnesses and clear video footage of the assault. But the aftermath was unlike anything in their experience. The victim refused pain medication, she reported, multiple fractures in his jaw, and he refused pain medication because he wanted to give a clear statement. "I've never seen anything like his composure." "What about the attacker?" asked her supervisor. "Completely cooperative. Almost seemed confused about his own actions. Keeps asking how Thompson remained standing." I think the guard's reaction shocked him more than it shocked anyone else. As the night wore on, the story continued to evolve. Social media was exploding with reactions from around the world. Military veterans were sharing the story with pride, calling Thompson an inspiration. Sports fans were debating whether Victor's career could survive this scandal. British citizens were expressing outrage that someone had assaulted a member of the Royal Guard. But the most powerful reactions were coming from ordinary people who were simply amazed by Thompson's character. His response to unprovoked violence had touched something deep in people who were tired of seeing aggression and anger dominate the headlines. By dawn, hashtags like Tar Sergeant Thompson and Royal Guard Strength were trending worldwide. The man who had simply been doing his job 12 hours earlier had become an international symbol of dignity, discipline, and grace under pressure. Victor, sitting in his cell awaiting arraignment, had no idea that his moment of rage had created a hero. All he knew was that his life as he had known it was over, destroyed by his inability to control his temper when faced with a man who embodied everything he was not. The immediate consequences were just the beginning of a story that would change both men's lives forever. The video footage of Sergeant Thompson absorbing Victor's punch became one of the most watched clips in internet history. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 100 million times across all platforms. But more than just the numbers, it was the emotional response from viewers around the world that made this story extraordinary. Military communities everywhere embraced Thompson as a symbol of everything their profession represented. General Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking female officer in the British Army, released a statement that was picked up by news outlets globally. Sergeant Thompson's response exemplifies the finest traditions of military service, she declared. Under unprovoked attack, he maintained his discipline, his dignity, and his commitment to duty. He represents the very best of what we train our soldiers to become. Similar statements poured in from military leaders in the United States, Canada, Australia, and dozens of other countries. Thompson had become an international symbol of military professionalism, and he didn't even know it yet. He was still recovering from surgery and had been deliberately kept away from news coverage on doctors' orders. The reaction from the sports world was more complicated. Many fighters and athletes condemned Victor's actions, but others tried to defend him by pointing to the pressures of professional competition and the effects of alcohol. This only made the public more angry. Former UFC champion Daniel Cormier appeared on several news programs to discuss the incident. "There's no excuse for what Victor did," he said firmly. "We're trained fighters, which means we have a greater responsibility to control ourselves, not less. What that guard did, staying calm and professional after taking a hit like that, that's more courage than any of us have ever shown in the octagon." But it was the reaction from ordinary people that truly drove the story into global phenomenon territory. Social media was flooded with posts from individuals sharing their own stories of maintaining composure under pressure. Inspired by Thompson's example, teachers wrote about staying calm with difficult students. Healthcare workers shared stories of maintaining professionalism with abusive patients. Service workers described keeping their dignity when faced with aggressive customers. Thompson's response had given people a new standard for grace under pressure. The financial consequences for Victor continued to mount. Beyond losing his sponsorship deals and UFC title, he was facing multiple lawsuits. The palace was pursuing both criminal charges and civil damages. His former sponsors were demanding return of signing bonuses. His own management company was considering dropping him as a client. His career earnings over the past 5 years were approximately $42 million, his accountant explained to a small group of reporters. At this point, legal fees and damage settlements could consume most of that. He went from being worth $50 million to potentially being in debt, all because of one punch. But Victor's financial ruin was only part of the story that was captivating the world. A completely unexpected development was taking place that nobody could have predicted. A crowdfunding campaign had been started by Sarah Chen, a teacher from Manchester, who had been moved by Thompson's story. She initially hoped to raise £5,000 to send flowers and a thank you note to the sergeant, but the campaign exploded beyond her wildest expectations. "I just thought this man deserved to know how much he had inspired people," Sarah explained to a BBC reporter. "I never imagined it would grow like this." The crowdfunding page was receiving donations from around the world at a rate of thousands per hour. Construction workers from Texas, teachers from Japan, retired soldiers from Germany, nurses from Brazil. People from every walk of life were contributing whatever they could afford. By the end of the first week, the fund had raised over £2 million. The donations came with messages that revealed how deeply Thompson's response had affected people. "This man showed more strength in 5 minutes than I've shown in 5 years of dealing with bullies at work. Thank you for the inspiration." Anonymous donor from Canada. "My son is serving overseas, and when I saw this video I felt so proud of the uniform he wears. Please give this to Sergeant Thompson with my gratitude." Mary Kay, mother of a deployed soldier. "I've been going through cancer treatment and some days I want to give up. But if this guard can take that punch and keep standing, I can keep fighting too." Anonymous donor from Australia. The messages kept coming, thousands of them, each telling a personal story of how Thompson's composure had inspired someone to be better, stronger, or more dignified in their own life. Major news networks began running feature stories about the global response. CNN's Anderson Cooper dedicated an entire segment to reading some of the donation messages on air. The BBC created a documentary crew to follow the story's development. Even entertainment shows were covering the phenomenon. "I've been in television for 25 years, said longtime news anchor Tom Bradshaw, and I've never seen a single incident capture the global imagination like this. People are hungry for examples of real character, and this guard provided something they didn't even know they were looking for." Meanwhile, Victor's situation continued to deteriorate. His court appearance had been delayed while his legal team tried to work out a plea agreement, but the public pressure made any lenient sentence unlikely. Protesters had gathered outside the courthouse holding signs, reading "Justice for Sergeant Thompson" and "No special treatment for bullies." The contrast between the two men's treatment in the media couldn't have been more stark. Victor was portrayed as a cautionary tale about unchecked aggression and celebrity privilege. Thompson was being celebrated as a hero who had shown the world what true strength looked like. International military academies began using the footage as a training tool, showing cadets what proper discipline looked like under extreme pressure. Business schools started discussing Thompson's response as an example of leadership and professionalism. Even elementary schools were using the story to teach children about controlling their emotions and treating others with respect. The Queen herself issued a brief statement through Buckingham Palace. The royal family commends Sergeant Thompson for his exemplary conduct in the face of unprovoked aggression. His professionalism and dedication to duty represent the finest traditions of service to the Crown. But perhaps the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Veterans organizations around the world began sharing the story as an example of why military service created better citizens. Recruitment offices reported increased interest from young people who said they wanted to develop the same kind of character Thompson had displayed. By the 2-week mark, the crowdfunding campaign had raised over £4 million, making it one of the largest spontaneous charitable efforts in British history. Plans were being made to establish a foundation in Thompson's name to support military families and veterans' causes. Victor, watching all of this unfold from his legal team's office, finally began to understand the magnitude of what had happened. He hadn't just lost his career and his fortune. He had accidentally created a global movement celebrating everything he was not: restraint over aggression, dignity over dominance, service over self-interest. The man he had tried to humiliate with a single punch had become more famous and respected than Victor had ever been, and he had done it simply by refusing to abandon his principles when faced with violence. The global reaction was still building, and neither man knew that their lives were about to intersect again in a way that would surprise the entire world. 6 months after the incident that shocked the world, Victor sat in the small office of Dr. Helen Rodriguez, a therapist who specialized in anger management and addiction counseling. He had lost everything: his title, his fortune, his reputation, and his sense of identity. But for the first time in his adult life, he was beginning to understand who he really was beneath all the fame and aggression. "I keep thinking about that moment," Victor told Dr. Rodriguez during one of their sessions. "I hit him with everything I had and he just took it like it was nothing. I've been trying to understand how someone does that. Why do you think the difference was between you and Sergeant Thompson in that moment?" Dr. Rodriguez asked. Victor was quiet for a long time. "He knew who he was," he finally said. "I thought I did, but I was wrong. I thought I was a champion, but really I was just angry. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone." The therapy sessions were part of Victor's court-ordered community service, but they had become something more. For the first time, he was examining the anger that had driven him his entire life: the poverty, the abandonment, the constant need to prove himself through violence. It was all connected to that moment when he had lashed out at a man who had done nothing wrong. Meanwhile, Sergeant Thompson had returned to duty after 3 months of medical leave. His jaw had healed, but the experience had changed him in ways he was still discovering. The global attention had been overwhelming at first, but he had handled it with the same composed professionalism that had made him famous. The crowdfunding campaign had ultimately raised over £6 million, and Thompson had insisted that most of it be used to establish a foundation supporting military veterans and their families. He kept only enough to pay for his medical expenses and help his parents with their mortgage. "I didn't do anything special," Thompson told reporters when he returned to active duty. "I just did my job. If that inspired people, I'm honored. But I don't want anyone to think I'm some kind of hero. The real heroes are the people who serve others every day without recognition." But the world disagreed. Thompson had been promoted to staff sergeant and had received commendations from military organizations around the globe. More importantly, he had become a symbol of dignity and restraint that people cited whenever they talked about handling conflict with grace. What nobody expected was what happened. Next, Victor's lawyer received a phone call from a representative of the Thompson Foundation, the charity established with the crowdfunding money. They wanted to know if Victor would be interested in speaking at their first annual conference about veterans' mental health and anger management. "They want me to speak?" Victor asked in disbelief. "About what?" "How to destroy your life in 10 seconds. His lawyer smiled. "Actually, yes. That's exactly what they want you to talk about. They think your story could help other people who struggle with anger and impulse control." The idea seemed impossible. Why would an organization founded because of his terrible behavior want him involved? But after discussing it with Dr. Rodriguez, Victor decided to reach out directly to Thompson. The meeting took place in a small coffee shop in London, away from media attention. Victor arrived early, nervous in a way he had never been before any fight. When Thompson walked in, Victor was struck by how normal he looked. Not like a symbol or a hero, just a regular person who happened to possess extraordinary character. "Sergeant Thompson," Victor said, standing up awkwardly. I wanted to apologize for what I did, for how I acted. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to know." Thompson sat down across from him and studied Victor's face. The arrogance and aggression that had been so obvious that night at the palace were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "I appreciate you saying that," Thompson said quietly. "I won't pretend it wasn't a difficult experience, but I've been thinking about it a lot, and I believe people can change if they want to." They talked for 2 hours. Victor explained his childhood, his struggles with anger, and the therapy he had been attending. Thompson shared his own experiences with discipline and service, and how his military training had shaped his response to conflict. "The thing is," Thompson said as their conversation wound down, "I think what happened that night might have been exactly what both of us needed. You needed to hit bottom to realize you had to change. And maybe the world needed to see that there's a different way to respond to aggression. 3 months later, Victor appeared on stage at the Thompson Foundation's inaugural conference. The audience of 500 veterans, family members, and counselors wasn't sure what to expect. Many of them still saw him as the villain in Thompson's story. But Victor's speech was unlike anything he had ever done before. Gone was the boastful fighter who had once demanded respect through intimidation. In his place was a man who spoke honestly about failure, accountability, and the long journey toward becoming someone better. 6 months ago, I thought strength meant never backing down from a fight, Victor told the audience. I thought respect had to be taken by force. Sergeant Thompson showed me that real strength is staying calm when someone tries to make you lose control. Real respect is earned by how you treat others, especially when they can't fight back. The response was overwhelming. Veterans who had struggled with their own anger issues approached Victor after the speech to share their stories. Counselors asked him to speak at other events. Most surprisingly, Thompson himself came on stage to shake Victor's hand in front of the entire audience. This is what transformation looks like, Thompson told the crowd. It's not easy and it's not quick, but it's possible. Mr. Petrov has shown more courage in admitting his mistakes and working to change than many people show in a lifetime. The image of the 2 men shaking hands, the guard who had absorbed the punch and the fighter who had thrown it, became as iconic as the original incident. It represented something people desperately wanted to believe, that even the worst moments could lead to positive change. Victor never fought professionally again. Instead, he became a full-time advocate for anger management and youth counseling. The foundation he established with his remaining money helped at-risk young people learn to channel their aggression into positive outlets. Thompson continued his military service and was eventually promoted to warrant officer. He became a sought-after speaker on leadership and crisis management, though he always insisted that his response that night had been nothing special. But their most important collaboration was yet to come. Together, they developed a program for schools and community centers that taught conflict resolution and emotional control. The program, called Standing Strong, used their story as an example of how both aggression and restraint were choices that people could learn to make. The night I hit you was the worst moment of my life, Victor said during one of their joint presentations to a group of teenagers, but it led to the best changes I've ever made. Sometimes we need to completely fall apart before we can build ourselves into who we're supposed to be. Thompson would always add, and sometimes the most important thing we can do is show others that dignity and respect are always possible, no matter what someone else chooses to do. The transformation that began with a moment of shocking violence had created something beautiful. 2 men who had found their true purpose by learning from their worst and best moments. Their story continued to inspire people around the world, proving that even the darkest incidents could become sources of light for others. The punch that shocked the world had ultimately changed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined, creating a legacy of hope that would last far longer than any championship belt or military medal. The moment arrived with shocking suddenness. 1 second, Victor was standing there arguing with Sergeant Thompson, and the next second his right fist was flying through the air toward the guard's face. There was no warning, no final threat or countdown, just pure explosive violence born from alcohol, frustration, and wounded pride. Victor's punch was picture perfect. His feet were planted correctly, his hips rotated with devastating power, and his fist was positioned to deliver maximum impact. This was the same right hand that had knocked out 12 professional fighters in the UFC octagon. The same punch that had ended championship fights and made him millions of dollars. The same technique he had practiced thousands of times until it became as natural as breathing. The sound of impact echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Victor's knuckles connected squarely with Thompson's jaw just below his left ear. It was a clean hit that would have dropped any normal person instantly. The force was incredible, probably generating over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. But something impossible happened. Sergeant Thompson didn't fall down. His head snapped back from the impact and a trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. His body swayed slightly to one side as he absorbed the tremendous force of the blow, but his feet remained planted firmly on the red carpet of Buckingham Palace, and after a moment that seemed to last forever, he straightened back up to his original position, The entire ballroom fell into complete silence. 200 of London's most important people stood frozen in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the string quartet's music trailed off as the musicians turned to stare at the unfolding drama. Victor himself was the most shocked person in the room. He stared at his own fist, then at Thompson's face, then back at his fist again. This wasn't supposed to happen. When Viktor Petrov hit someone, they went down. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The punch had landed perfectly. Victor could feel it in his knuckles, could hear it in the solid impact sound, could see it in the blood on Thompson's lip. But somehow, impossibly, the guard was still standing, still looking straight ahead with that same calm, professional expression, still maintaining his perfect military posture. Thompson's jaw was already beginning to swell and the pain was intense. The punch had definitely fractured something. He could feel the grinding sensation when he moved his mouth slightly, but his military training had prepared him for much worse. He had taken shrapnel in Afghanistan and kept fighting. A broken jaw, even one delivered by a world champion, wasn't going to make him abandon his post. The most remarkable thing about Thompson's reaction wasn't that he stayed standing. It was that he didn't react at all. No anger flashed in his eyes. No fists clenched in retaliation. No aggressive posture or threatening movements. He simply absorbed the most powerful punch most people would ever witness, adjusted his uniform slightly, and continued doing his job. Victor took a step backward, his face showing complete bewilderment. "What the hell?" he muttered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "How are you still standing?" Thompson's response was delivered in the same calm, professional tone he had used all evening, despite the blood on his lip and the obvious pain he was experiencing. "Sir, I need to ask you to step away from this area. Security will be with you shortly." The reaction was so unexpected, so contrary to everything Victor understood about violence and confrontation, that it left him completely off balance. In his world, when you hit someone, they either hit you back or they went down. They didn't just stand there and politely ask you to move along. Tony, Victor's manager, was the first person to break the spell of silence that had fallen over the room. "Oh my God," he whispered, pulling out his phone to call their lawyer. "Victor, what have you done?" But Victor wasn't listening to his manager. He was still staring at Thompson in complete disbelief. The guard's composure was more devastating than any counterpunch could have been. It made Victor look like an out-of-control child throwing a tantrum, while Thompson looked like a professional soldier doing his duty under impossible circumstances. Camera phones started appearing throughout the crowd as guests realized they were witnessing something historic. The footage would be on social media within minutes and on international news within hours. But in that moment, everyone was still too shocked to fully process what they had seen. Palace security finally arrived, having been alerted by the radio calls from concerned staff members. 4 guards in plain clothes surrounded Victor, but they moved carefully. They had all seen what just happened, and they knew they were dealing with someone extremely dangerous. "Sir, we need you to come with us," said the lead security officer, a middle-aged man with the calm demeanor of someone who had dealt with difficult situations before. Victor looked around at all the faces staring at him. Every person in that elegant ballroom was looking at him with a mixture of horror, disgust, and fascination. These were people who lived their entire lives without witnessing violence, and he had just brought the brutal reality of his world into their refined space. But it was Thompson's reaction that haunted Victor the most. The guard hadn't shown fear, anger, or even surprise. He had absorbed a championship-level punch and responded with the same professional courtesy he would show to any other guest. It was the most humiliating response Victor could have received. "This is impossible," Victor said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Nobody takes a hit like that and just stands there." Thompson finally allowed himself to touch his jaw gently, checking the extent of the damage. The pain was significant, but he had experienced worse. What bothered him more was that he had failed in his primary duty. His job was to prevent incidents like this from happening, not to become the victim of one. As palace security began escorting Victor toward the exit, he kept looking back at Thompson. The guard had returned to his original position and was once again standing perfectly still, as if nothing had happened. Only the blood on his uniform and the swelling on his face provided evidence of the attack. The crowd of guests began to murmur among themselves as Victor was led away, Words like shocking, unbelievable, and disgraceful could be heard throughout the room. But the most common reaction was simply stunned silence. Violence at a Palace charity event was unthinkable. But what they had witnessed went beyond just the assault itself. They had seen a professional fighter deliver his most powerful punch to a man who had no opportunity to defend himself, and they had watched that man absorb the blow with a dignity and composure that seemed almost superhuman. It was a display of character under pressure that few of them had ever witnessed. As Victor disappeared through the ballroom doors, still shaking his head in disbelief, the guests slowly began to return to their conversations. But the evening was effectively over. Nothing that happened after this moment would be remembered or discussed. The only thing anyone would talk about was the impossible sight of Sergeant David Thompson taking a championship punch and remaining standing. The incident that would shock the world had occurred in less than 10 seconds, but its impact would last for years to come.